You've been doing a good job in keeping up with everything. Thank you for that. And we're going to be in our history today. So this book right here, we're going to be talking about page 37. If you want to follow along, if you just want to listen, that's also okay. We've been talking about the Indian tribes, the Native American tribes. These are the people that lived in the United States before anyone else did. And these are people that lived in separate little tribes. Remember, we talked about that. So they didn't have really gigantic and large cities like we do today. They just had small little villages hither and yon throughout all of America. Kind of interesting in the thoughts of this. Of course, when the white man, the Europeans landed, we landed from boats onto the eastern coast of the United States. But the Indians lived all over America. So we're talking about some of the 5 different spots that they lived in, and specifically 5 different tribes. But there were many, many tribes that, I don't even know anything about. But tribes you hear about, the Mohicans, the Comanches, the Nez Perce, those were other tribes that were also in America at the same time. Well, we've just picked out 5, okay? Because they have 5 different lifestyles, so to speak. We've been talking about the Cherokee. That's where we first started, and they lived in the summer and the winter house, and they were the ones that wore deer skin, and they were the ones that, well, they didn't have to wear much of anything. They were the ones that were known for their weapons, and they had the blow darts, and they had the fish traps, and that was that group. And they stayed in permanently, so they didn't move. So they were in the summer house and the winter house, and those houses were built out of poles and weeds and mud pushed into the weeds to kind of look like plaster. And so that was that group right there, and they had gardens, so they were never hungry, and they were the ones that played little brother to war. Remember that funny story? Well, then we went and they were in the southeast by Alabama and Georgia, in that area. Then we went up north by the Canadian border where, I think where Maine is, in that area. Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, okay, right in there. Those people there were the Chippewas, and they lived in places called wigwams, but they really lived mostly in the forest. They were the ones that gathered wild rice and the blueberries and the maple syrup. They were the ones that also wore deer skin. They were the ones that could walk quietly through the forest. So we learned about them. All of these Indians that we're talking about were very peaceful Indians. There were many Indians that were more on the savage side. And next year, if you read Little House on the Prairie with Mrs. Hedden, you'll hear about some of their Laura and Mary, and how afraid they are of the Indians, because the Indians were not known to be a kind, gentle kind of people. Many Indians were rough, and they'd never been tamed their hearts had never been changed by the Son of God, and so that's why. And we all tend to be rough, and all, of course, are sinners. And so these Indians, without the knowledge of God, did not have there was no change of heart, and so it made them more of a fierce nation than later on, that they became quieter and milder. But the 5 tribes we're talking about are mild tribes, not tribes that were warriors. The one we're going to talk about today, these people lived right in the middle of the United States, where Kansas, Nebraska, right there, where that is. It's a very flat place. They call the plains because it's just plain. There's no tall mountains. And so these Indians live there. And it's a funny name. It's spelled Sioux, but it's pronounced Sioux. And these were the Sioux Indians, and they lived in the grassy plains. And when you think about the Sioux Indians, you need to think about the buffalo. The buffalo was their friend. This is where the buffalo lived. And I know one of you on your last test, I think it was your Chippewa test, when I asked you to describe 3 kinds of meat they could have eaten, one of you put buffalo. No. Buffalo could not live. They could not survive up in the Maine area. It's too rocky. It's too rough. It's too mountainous. But here in the plains, this is where the buffalo are happy. Oh my. And these Indians loved the buffalo. And because they needed the buffalo for absolutely everything, these Indians followed the buffalo. So wherever the buffalo went, these Indians went. These in the area, the reason that buffalo liked it so much was the fact that there was some streams of water that were kind of calm, kind of streams, but it's because it was flat. And buffalo don't do mountains; they do flat land. And so the buffalo, they meandered here, they meandered there, and they're like cows in the fact that they travel in a herd, and they also could be stampeded, and that was always a scary thing where they would run wild, and that was scary. It's scary anytime there's a stampede, whether it's a buffalo, whether it's a cow. So these were those kind of animals that liked it where it was grassy. They could eat all the grass they wanted, and they could meander here and there and everywhere because there were no mountains. So you need to know it's a flat place. You need to know the buffalo was most important. Buffalo meat was what they ate. They ate buffalo. They killed the buffalo. Buffalo is a very large animal, probably even bigger than a cow. In some, mostly I'm thinking this might be a little bigger than a cow. And so it gives a lot of meat. So a lot of the Sioux Indians could eat at one time on the buffalo. But of course there was no refrigerators. There was no refrigeration. That had not been invented yet. So there was no way to really keep buffalo meat. You could eat it, okay? You could eat it, first day it'd be wonderful. Second day, maybe so-so. Third day, okay. By the time the week was up and the buffalo had been sitting out, there was, it was kind of getting towards the rotten side of beef or of meat. And it wasn't, it was not as healthy for you. Now, Indians would eat, many Indians even ate it when it was rotten. I mean, they had, I don't know, the power to overcome the bacteria. White man, I don't think could do that. But they could. They were used to living a little more rugged life than most of us have ever lived. And so they would kill a buffalo and they would eat it. And they would share it with everyone, of course. But you'd have so much buffalo left over because there was no refrigerator. There was no way to freeze anything, except in the wintertime, of course. But there was no way. So they would take the rest of the buffalo and they would dry it into jerky. But they like their jerky, instead of just making strips of buffalo, they like to take some of the fat and some of the buffalo meat and some juice that they would find, like juice like you would find in cherries, that kind of thing. They had some wild cherries. And they would take that and mix it all together and make it kind of a patty, like you would a hamburger patty. You know what a hamburger looks like when you open up the bun. There's a patty. And it's made out of beef, usually. And so that's what they would do. And they would make these patties. And they put them in the sunshine. And it was a little more flavorful than just jerky. Buffalo meat is very lean, and so it doesn't have a ton of fat in it so much. And so it's the fat that gives meat flavor. That's why when you buy prime rib, which has a lot of fat in it, it's a more flavorful meat than if you buy a steak that has no fat in it. It's just not as tasty to your taste buds. And so the Sioux Indians would take this buffalo meat and cherry juice and fat and grind it all up or smash it all up and make it into patties, dry it in the sunshine, and it was called pemmican. Pemmican, and I think it probably says it there on page 37. It was pemmican, and they were round patties, and they could carry them in their pouch. They could carry them wherever they went. I don't know if they had wild horses at this time, but I think they didn't have horses yet. They would later, but they would take them wherever they walked, wherever they went hunting. They would take this pemmican, just like you would take beef jerky with you. And they'd carry it in their leather pouch, and it was good and nutritious, and they didn't have any fast foods, so there wasn't any way to eat. If you were going hunting, you couldn't just stop by McDonald's and have a hamburger. So they had to bring their food with them. So pemmican was one of the ways they used the buffalo. Another way they used the buffalo was they used his hide. And buffalo hide was very thick and was very hairy. Now they could take the hair off, and they used the hair to make ropes. They also used the insides of the buffalo to make ropes, tendons, and pieces of intestine. Those are hard, tough pieces of fibrous inside a buffalo, and so they would use those as ropes to tie this or that together. The buffalo, the fur of the buffalo, they would weave, and sometimes they would use that to make rope. The horns of the buffalo, they would use as drinking cups, and they would cut it and they would hollow it out, and they would use those as a cup. Every part of the buffalo was important to them. They would take the buffalo skin off, and they would use that as kind of like a shag rug, a rug in their house, a rug in their teepee, which is what they lived in. Sometimes they would take the fur off and just use the hide itself. But whatever the buffalo had, they used. One of the things that they used the buffalo for was that they made their houses out of it, and their houses were called teepees. And when I was a little girl, I thought every Indian had a teepee. But no, it was just the Sioux Indians. They basically had teepees. That was their house. They didn't have wigwams, and they didn't have the summer house, the winter house. They had teepees. And they made it from poles, and they made it with this buffalo hide. Now the poles were the hard, buffalo was easy to get, but the poles were the hard part to get, because this is an area where there's not a lot of trees. There's a lot of grass, but there's not a lot of tall trees. So finding the trees to get the poles was quite the task. But they would use the poles for all of their lifetime. So they would get 4 or 5 poles, and they would use them to build their teepees. And they would put the poles up, and they would wrap this buffalo skin around, and they would have to sew it together, because one buffalo is not that big, but they would have to sew the skins together, and then women did that. And that was women's job. And then, of course, they decorated with their hides. Lots of the times they decorate just like your mom probably decorates your house. Okay, you probably have things hanging on your walls, or you have pretty things sitting on your end tables in your living room, or your coffee table. You know, mommies are into decorating, and so your house is probably decorated. And these Indians like to decorate their house just as well. Sometimes they would put burn marks in, or sometimes they would use coloring from berries, smash berries, and use that coloring to make different designs on their teepees. So these Indians were teepee dwellers, and that's where they lived. And the reason they needed to live in a teepee was there weren't forests like the Chippewas, and they certainly were. They didn't stay in one place, because they had to follow the buffalo. So they would get their teepee set up, and they would realize, oh, the buffalo are moving, and if the buffalo moved 100 miles, then they'd have to take up their teepees and all of their stuff, and they'd have to go closer to where the buffaloes lived. Now, they couldn't just live right beside them, but they'd have to be closer to them where the buffaloes roamed, and then they'd set up camp there, and they'd be there until the buffalo moved again. And the buffalo was constantly moving, because he was constantly in need of food, and he was looking where new grass grows. So the buffalo would move up the way 50 miles or 100 miles, or maybe even 200 miles, and the buffalo herd would live there, and all of the little Sioux Indians, they would follow the buffalo. So the buffalo was big. It was the big, important animal. And there were no other major animals in this area. There were small animals, of course, but there were no forests, so there was no place for deer and elk and moose, which the other Indians enjoyed, but not this group. This group followed the buffalo. The buffalo was their source of everything. They took the buffalo bones and what they made knives out of. They took his rib cage. You know, you can imagine a buffalo would have a lot of nice ribs, and they were kind of curved, and they would use, when they had to move, they would take all of their stuff and make kind of a sled, and they'd get wild dogs, and the wild dogs would pull the teepees from place to place, and they'd use the bones of the buffalo to kind of make a sled, and they would tie the stuff to the sled bones, or tie the bones together, and it worked out. And they travel up the road. I mean, you couldn't carry all that stuff, and if they had no horses, they couldn't. They would have had to carry it somehow. So they just used the buffalo, and they drug it, and they had these wild dogs which helped them, kind of like, you've seen those old movies of the sled dogs in Alaska, or maybe, and they'd pull along. And so same thing with these Indians would use their dogs. On page 38 at the top there, you can see some of the designs that the Indian ladies had made, and you can see a picture of their dogs. Their dogs weren't really, they were wild, so they kept them at bay, and they really weren't a tame dog. Not like your dog. I mean, they wouldn't invite them to come into their house. They weren't that tame, but they were powerful, and probably part wolf, and so they were powerful dogs, and they could do a lot of good pulling. You can see it tells you a little bit there about the dogs. It tells you a little bit about things that they made out of the buffalo skin. So just know that the buffalo was a big, important animal to this tribe. Okay, that's all we have for now, and then we'll listen to some more buffalo talk and some Sioux Indian talk next week. Okay, bye-bye.